One social enterprise which seeks to tackle funeral poverty is concerned about the rising cost of a service in Scotland, estimated to be around £4,000. Caledonia Funeral Aid is urging the Scottish Government to reconsider the average funeral support payment to those who are eligible. We're speaking to the charity's co-founder in just a moment, but first, let's listen to the experience of one man, James, who lost his partner Rochelle in 2022.
I had learned about the hardship fund. Someone had told me about it, and I applied for it, and they said they'd pay so much for the funeral. But it wasn't until after I'd done it that I realised that Rochelle had a golden charter that she had paid for, thinking that would pay for her whole funeral, so I wouldn't have any problems paying for a funeral and things for her. But even after that was paid, I still had another £2,500 to pay out after for funeral costs and to open up the grave and things like that, which I really wasn't expected. And when I did apply for the hardship for the funeral fund, then I was awarded, I think it was 99 pence or £1.99, because she'd already had a golden charter in place.
So if you've actually paid into a fund, you're not really eligible for much money from the government?
Yeah.
And so that left you with a huge amount left to pay. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I still had to pay for undertaker to open up, or the council to open up the grave, even though she had paid for the plot. She thought, well, that was it, paid for, and didn't have to pay any more out. But still had another £800 to pay for that, and funeral cars and things on top of that, headstones and things, and it all mounted up to about £2,500.
Which is a lot of money. I mean, did you struggle to get that amount of money together?
Yeah, well, I did to start with. I kind of scrimped and scraped round about. Luckily enough, a lot of it was spread out, so I didn't really have to do it all in a winner. But even though the undertaker was still looking for his money 14 days after the service.
That must have been pretty stressful, because, in addition to obviously the grief that you're feeling at the time.
Yeah, well, it was stress that I didn't think I was going to have to go through. But it just, you just deal with it. I was one of these people that just deals with it, and that's it. I just get on with things and can scrimp away and no spend money on things I don't have to.
What would your message be then to the government, which isn't planning on changing the level of payment at the moment?
The money that you receive, the actual cost of a funeral nowadays, even for a basic funeral, which Rochelle had, was £67,000. And the government don't pay anywhere near that kind of cost. The bereaved family, I've got to try and find that money for to pay out, because it's still got to get paid, whether it's paid in a lump sum or paid over many weeks or months. They need to have a look at things and have a look at the true cost of what it is for a funeral in modern Scotland.
That's James, who lost his partner Rochelle in 2022. The Scottish Government did give us a statement saying it substantially widened eligibility compared to the UK Government's funeral payment, also saying the payment will actually be increased by 6.7%, subject to approval. Let's speak to John Halliday, who is the co-founder of Caledonia Funeral Aid. John, they are planning an increase, but from what James was saying there, the shortfall seems to be a lot bigger than that.
Yes, thanks for having me on. I think we should give some credit to the Scottish Government here. They're absolutely right about widening it, and they have been increasing it alongside inflation. But funeral costs have been inflating by far higher than living costs have been going up over 2 decades. So I think people typically, James is a good example of this, when they come to pay for a funeral, just shocked at how expensive it is these days, where a basic funeral being over £4,000. And typically, even for those who are eligible, which is just a small number of families, of course, for the Scottish funeral support payment, are getting less than half of that towards the cost. It leaves them a lot to gather up front. And often, a lot of that has to be paid as a deposit before the funeral director would even go ahead with booking a funeral date in. people can really struggle to even get a funeral director to take them on if they're on benefits in the first place.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? He didn't actually get the government payment because she had already been paying into a funeral plan. So for people who are on benefits, it sounds like it doesn't make sense to pay into a plan.
It's actually a really hard thing to advise anyone, and I certainly wouldn't be providing direct advice to anyone individually about taking on a plan or not. But it's not a clear-cut situation, I think, is part of it. This is a topic area where people are constantly getting caught off guard by what the costs are, what kind of things they need to anticipate, what the best approach is. A plan, it's for you to decide whether or not to do that. Certainly having a sense that you've maybe some savings available, but more important than that, giving instructions about what kind of funeral you expect to your next of kin is essential. And then to listen to what people say when they say that. About a third of people say their priority is not to spend lots of money. People often really want the family they leave behind to benefit from any savings they have rather than spend it on, I hear terrible stories of a small number of funeral directors really forcefully upselling things like fake oak coffins for hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. These are terrible. They're not entirely isolated instances, and there are great funeral directors out there. But every time I hear that kind of story, it just makes me boil with rage. So we need to shop around and avoid being upsold things.
And what kind of help does your charity give? Does it give advice? Does it give money?
So we've got a funeral self-support website called funerals.scot, which I'd advise everyone to look at, whether or not you can afford a funeral. It's useful just to think about your options. We've got a helpline that's open most days of the week for people, particularly aimed at those who are struggling in some ways around the affordability of funerals. We can try to direct people there. And for a very small number of people where it's appropriate, we actually organize our own funeral director service for direct cremations, but it's a small part of what we do. We're really there to provide impartial advice to as many people as we can who are struggling. And we know that 1 in 6 families, when they come to pay for a funeral, end up this year struggling to afford their rent, their bills, or essential food.
John, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today. That's John Halliday there from Caledonia Funeral Aid.